Some houses stay empty because they were never meant to forget. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, but the forest still dripped with the slow, cold rhythm of lingering storms as Nathan Cole guided his old black Ford pickup down the narrow road curling through the pines of northern Maine. Fog floated low across the ground like pale smoke, weaving between tree trunks and broken stone fences that looked older than memory itself. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with silver-gray fur and sharp amber eyes that reflected every flicker of movement outside the windshield. Nathan kept one hand loosely on the steering wheel while the other rested against the worn envelope sitting on the passenger seat between them. The letter had arrived 3 weeks earlier with no return address, no explanation, and no warmth. Just a name he barely recognized. Eleanor Vale, his mother's older sister, dead at 82. And somehow, she had left him a house he never knew existed. The farther north they drove, the quieter the world became. Gas stations disappeared first, then traffic, then phone signal. By the time the truck rolled past the rusted sign welcoming travelers into Blackwater Cove, even the wind seemed to whisper instead of howl. Nathan noticed the old men outside the general store watching his truck in silence. One of them removed his cap slowly when he saw the address written on the folded property deed resting against the dashboard. No one waved. No one smiled. Ranger's ears twitched. The dog sat taller now, muscles tightening beneath his thick coat. Nathan glanced sideways at him. "You feel it too, huh?" Ranger didn't move. The road narrowed again, bending toward the lake where dead reeds swayed in the mist like skeletal fingers. Then Nathan finally saw it. The house stood alone at the edge of the water beneath a cluster of towering pine trees blackened by age and weather. 3 stories tall. Dark cedar siding faded almost gray. Several windows boarded shut. The roof sagged slightly above the western wing, as if the structure itself had grown tired from holding too many winters. A rusted weather vane turned slowly overhead with a long metallic creak. Nathan cut the engine. Silence rushed in immediately. Not peaceful silence. Heavy silence. The kind that made a man aware of his own breathing. Ranger stared straight ahead through the windshield. His ears lifted high. Then came the low growl deep in his throat. Nathan frowned. Easy. But Ranger didn't relax. The dog's amber eyes locked onto the second-floor window above the porch. Nathan followed his gaze. At first, he saw nothing except darkness behind dusty glass. Then the curtain moved. Just slightly. As if someone standing inside had stepped back out of sight. Nathan's pulse slowed the way it always did before danger. Not fear. Instinct. The training never really left men like him. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching softly over wet gravel. The air smelled of lake water, cedar bark, and something older buried beneath the cold. Ranger jumped down beside him, but refused to walk forward. Nathan reached the porch steps before realizing the dog had stopped completely. Ranger stood frozen near the truck, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the house. "Come on, boy." Nothing. Another gust of wind drifted through the trees. Somewhere far out on the lake, a buoy bell rang once. Hollow. Lonely. Nathan turned back toward the porch and noticed something hanging beside the front door. A child's wind chime made from silver spoons and tiny pieces of blue glass. It moved gently, even though the air around him had gone perfectly still. Then Ranger barked sharply. Once. Nathan looked up instinctively toward the second-floor window again. This time, he was certain of what he saw. A pale shape standing behind the glass. Watching him. The shape behind the second-floor window vanished so quickly Nathan almost convinced himself it had been nothing more than a trick of fog and failing light. But Ranger did not move. The German shepherd remained frozen near the truck, ears rigid, every muscle locked tight beneath his damp silver-gray coat. Nathan had seen that posture before in Afghanistan when Ranger's training had picked up movement long before human eyes ever could. The dog was not afraid. He was listening. A cold breeze drifted across the lake, carrying the smell of wet pine needles and something metallic hidden beneath the scent of rain. Nathan climbed the porch slowly, the old wooden boards groaning beneath his boots. Every step sounded louder than it should have, as though the house had forgotten what footsteps were supposed to sound like. Up close, the place looked even older. Thin cracks spread through the cedar walls like dark veins. Rust stained the hinges beside the front door. A faded child's handprint still lingered near the bottom frame beneath layers of peeling paint. Nathan reached for the brass doorknob and paused when he noticed it was warm. Not hot, just warmer than the cold air surrounding it. Ranger let out another low growl from the yard. Nathan pushed the door open anyway. The smell hit first. Dust, cedar, old smoke, and beneath it all, the faint sweetness of something long forgotten, like dried flowers trapped inside a closed attic for decades. Weak daylight filtered through dirty windows, stretching pale gray across the floorboards. The entry hall opened into a narrow living room lined with bookshelves and furniture hidden beneath white sheets. Somewhere deeper in the house, water dripped slowly in uneven intervals. Nathan stepped inside carefully while Ranger remained outside on the porch, refusing to cross the doorway. "You are really starting to make me nervous," Nathan muttered quietly. The house answered with a soft creak above him. Nathan's eyes lifted toward the ceiling. Silence returned immediately afterward, thick and watchful. He moved farther down the hallway, fingers brushing along the wall where old wallpaper curled at the corners like dried leaves. Framed photographs hung crooked beside the staircase. Most were too faded to recognize, but one caught his attention. A young woman standing beside the lake sometime in the late 1960s. Dark coat, long blonde hair moving in the wind. Her smile looked strangely familiar. Nathan stared a second longer before realizing why. She had his mother's eyes. Ranger barked sharply outside. Nathan turned toward the front door just as the wind slammed it shut behind him with enough force to shake dust from the ceiling beams. The sound echoed through the entire house. Then came another noise. Soft, hollow. 3 slow knocks somewhere deep inside the walls. Nathan stood perfectly still. Knock, knock, knock. The sound stopped. Ranger began barking again, louder this time, claws scraping frantically against the porch floor. Nathan moved back toward the entryway and tried the front door. It would not budge. He pulled harder. Nothing. The old brass knob rattled uselessly in his hand while the temperature inside the house seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Then Ranger suddenly went silent. Completely silent. Nathan felt the shift instantly. The kind of silence that arrives right before a storm breaks open. Slowly, he turned toward the staircase. At the top of the stairs stood a small figure in a pale blue dress. Motionless, watching him from the darkness above. Nathan did not breathe for several long seconds. The small figure at the top of the staircase remained perfectly still beneath the dim gray light leaking through the upstairs hallway window. Pale blue dress, bare feet, thin hands hanging at her sides. Her hair covered most of her face, but Nathan could feel her watching him the same way a man feels cold before snow begins to fall. Ranger exploded into frantic barking outside the front door, the deep, violent kind of bark he used only when something felt wrong beyond explanation. Nathan blinked once. The figure was gone. The hallway upstairs stood empty again. Only darkness remained near the railing. Nathan felt his pulse hammering harder now, but years of military training kept his body steady even while his instincts screamed at him to leave. Slowly he stepped toward the staircase. The old wood groaned beneath his boots as he climbed. Each step carried the smell of dust and damp cedar stronger into the air. Halfway up, he noticed something strange. The layer of dust covering the stairs stopped abruptly near the second-floor landing, as if someone had been walking there recently. Fresh marks cut through the gray powder. Small footprints. Bare feet. Nathan reached the top step and paused. The hallway stretched ahead beneath cracked wallpaper stained by age and moisture. Most of the doors stood partially open, except one at the very end. Closed. Unlike the others, that door looked newer, cleaner. Ranger continued barking below, but the sound suddenly became muffled, distant somehow, as if the house itself were swallowing the noise. Nathan moved carefully past the open rooms. One contained a rusted iron bed frame. Another held stacks of yellowed newspapers piled waist-high. But as he neared the final door, the temperature changed again. Warmer this time. Not much. Just enough to feel alive compared to the cold, hollow air below. He touched the brass handle. Warm. The same warmth he had felt downstairs at the front door. Nathan pushed slowly inside. The room stopped him cold. Unlike the rest of the house, this room was untouched by decay. A small lamp sat neatly on a bedside table. A child's quilt rested perfectly folded across the bed. White curtains stirred gently near the window, even though the glass was shut tight. There was no dust anywhere. No smell of mildew. only the faint scent of lavender and old paper. Nathan stepped farther inside, confusion tightening his chest. "What is this place?" he whispered. Then he saw the music box, sitting on a small wooden dresser near the wall. Silver paint chipped around the edges. Tiny ballerina frozen beneath the glass lid. Without warning, the music box began to play. Soft piano notes drifted through the room, slow and delicate, like something remembered from childhood. Nathan froze. He had not touched it. Ranger suddenly stopped barking downstairs. Silence crashed through the house, so completely Nathan could hear the quiet ticking of the old clock mounted above the bed. Tick, tick, tick. Then came the sound beneath the floor. A faint scratching. Slow, uneven, like fingernails dragging lightly across wood somewhere underneath the room. Nathan lowered his eyes toward the floorboards. The scratching stopped instantly. A heartbeat later, 3 quiet knocks echoed beneath his boots. Knock, knock, knock. Nathan's stomach tightened. Ranger let out a low warning growl downstairs, softer now, uncertain. Nathan crossed slowly toward the dresser where the music box continued playing by itself. Beside it sat an old framed photograph, covered in faint cracks across the glass. Nathan picked it up carefully. His breath caught immediately. The woman in the picture stood beside the lake wearing a dark winter coat, smiling gently at the camera. Next to her stood a little girl in a pale blue dress. And behind them, partially hidden in the shadows of the porch window, was the outline of a tall man watching from inside the house. The music box slowed until the final note hung trembling in the room like breath against cold glass. Nathan lowered the photograph carefully, unable to stop staring at the shadowed figure standing behind the woman and little girl. The man's face was impossible to make out clearly, hidden behind the reflection in the old window, yet something about the shape of him felt deeply wrong. Not threatening. Worse than that. Familiar. Ranger barked once downstairs, sharp and urgent. Nathan slipped the photograph beneath his arm and stepped toward the bedroom door just as the scratching sound beneath the floor returned. This time it moved. Slow at first, then dragging steadily beneath the boards from one side of the room to the other. Nathan stopped moving entirely. The sound passed directly under his feet. Ranger began growling louder downstairs, claws scraping frantically against the hardwood floor below. Nathan crouched carefully and pressed his palm against the floorboards. Cold. But beneath the cold, he felt something else. A faint vibration pulsing through the wood in uneven intervals, almost like distant machinery buried deep underground. The scratching stopped beneath the far wall near the bed. Then silence. Nathan rose slowly and crossed toward the corner. The wallpaper there had peeled away in long curling strips, exposing darker wood underneath. Ranger barked again. 3 sharp bursts. Nathan's military instincts tightened instantly. That pattern meant detection, not fear. Detection. He pulled the hunting knife from his belt and used the handle to tap lightly against the wall. Hollow. Nathan frowned. He moved farther along the paneling. Solid. Then hollow again. A hidden space. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Someone had built something behind the wall. Before he could investigate further, a sudden gust slammed the bedroom door shut hard enough to shake the entire room. The lamp flickered once. Then darkness swallowed everything. Nathan stood motionless as the old house groaned around him. Wind pressed against the walls outside with a deep, mournful sound, but underneath it, he heard something else drifting faintly through the darkness. Breathing. Slow. Uneven. Not his own. Nathan reached instinctively for the flashlight clipped to his belt and clicked it on. The narrow beam cut across the room just as the music box started playing again by itself. The tiny ballerina beneath the glass spun slowly in circles while the soft piano melody echoed through the dark room. Nathan swept the flashlight toward the bed and froze. The quilt had changed. Moments earlier it had been folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. Now it lay spread open across the bed as though someone had just stood up from beneath it. Ranger began barking wildly downstairs. Nathan moved toward the bedroom door and pulled it open. The hallway beyond looked darker than before, the shadows thicker somehow. His flashlight flickered as he stepped into the corridor. Then he noticed the footprints. Small wet footprints crossing the dusty hallway floor. Bare feet. Fresh. They led away from the bedroom toward the far end of the hall where another narrow staircase disappeared upward into the attic. Nathan followed slowly while the old boards creaked beneath his weight. The footprints stopped halfway to the attic stairs. Right beside the wall, Nathan lifted the flashlight. Written across the faded wallpaper in shaky, uneven letters was a message that had not been there moments earlier. Stay out of the attic. The beam trembled slightly in Nathan's hand. Then Ranger suddenly yelped downstairs. Not a bark, not a growl. A sharp, painful cry Nathan had never heard from him before. Nathan spun instantly toward the staircase below. Ranger! Silence answered him for 2 long seconds. Then from somewhere above the attic came the sound of a little girl laughing softly in the dark. Nathan moved fast. The flashlight beam shook across the hallway walls as he rushed toward the staircase, boots pounding against the old floorboards while the sound of the little girl's laughter faded slowly above him, like smoke disappearing into darkness. Ranger, he shouted again. His voice echoed through the house, swallowed almost immediately by the deep, hollow silence pressing from every room. The air felt colder now, not the clean cold of winter air off the lake, but the kind of cold that settles into abandoned churches and places left empty too long. Nathan descended the stairs 2 at a time until he reached the first floor. Ranger stood near the kitchen doorway, rigid and trembling slightly beneath his thick coat. The German shepherd was staring toward the far end of the room, where darkness pooled beneath a hanging light fixture that no longer worked. Nathan exhaled quietly in relief when he saw the dog unharmed. Ranger rushed to him immediately, pressing tightly against his leg for only a second before turning back toward the kitchen. His ears stayed pinned low. Uneasy. Nathan knelt beside him. What happened? Ranger let out a soft whine and walked toward the kitchen entrance, stopping just before crossing inside. Nathan followed carefully. The kitchen smelled older than the rest of the house. Damp wood, rust, faint traces of burned coffee lingering beneath decades of dust. A long wooden table sat crooked beneath the window overlooking the lake. Cabinet doors hung partially open. The sink dripped slowly, even though no water should have been running after 40 years of neglect. Drip, drip, drip. Ranger moved cautiously across the floor, nose low, until he reached the far corner beside the old cast-iron stove. Then he froze again. Nathan noticed the floorboards there looked different from the others. Darker, less worn, as if they had been replaced at some point. Ranger pawed once at the wood, then twice. The same focus signal Nathan had trusted overseas more times than he could count. Detection. Nathan crouched beside the boards and swept his flashlight lower. Thin scratches marked the edges near the seams. Recent scratches. He reached for the pry bar hanging from his backpack and wedged it carefully between 2 boards. The wood resisted at first. Then one plank lifted with a loud, cracking groan that echoed sharply through the kitchen. A rush of stale, cold air escaped upward from the darkness below. Ranger backed away immediately, growling deep in his throat. Nathan shined the flashlight into the opening. Stone steps disappeared downward beneath the house. Narrow, ancient. Wet moisture glistened along the walls below like sweat on buried rock. Nathan stared silently for several seconds. Hidden tunnels were not uncommon in old properties this far north, especially near the lake. Smugglers once used underground routes along the Canadian border decades ago. But something about this stairwell felt wrong. Too hidden, too carefully sealed away. Ranger barked once sharply toward the darkness below. Then came the sound. Faint at first. Metallic. Like chains shifting slowly somewhere underground. Nathan felt the muscles in his neck tighten instantly. The sound stopped after only a few seconds, replaced by silence so complete he could hear the old house settling around them. Ranger stepped backward another pace, eyes fixed on the stairwell. Nathan raised the flashlight higher and noticed words carved into the inside edge of the wooden opening beneath layers of dirt and age. He brushed the surface carefully with his sleeve until the letters became visible. Do not let him hear you. Nathan read the sentence twice. Ranger began growling louder. Then the kitchen light above them flickered suddenly to life for half a second, even though the electricity had been dead since Nathan arrived. In that brief flash of yellow light, Nathan saw someone standing at the far end of the kitchen near the hallway entrance. Tall, motionless, watching them from the shadows. Then the light died again. Nathan swung the flashlight toward the hallway so fast the beam streaked wildly across the walls, but the figure was gone. Only darkness remained near the entrance to the living room. Ranger barked sharply, stepping in front of Nathan with his body low and tense, amber eyes fixed toward the empty hallway. The old house creaked softly around them as though reacting to their fear. Nathan listened carefully. Nothing moved now except the wind brushing against the lake outside. Yet the feeling of being watched refused to leave. Slowly, he lowered the flashlight again toward the hidden stairwell beneath the kitchen floor. Cold air continued rising from below, carrying the smell of wet stone and something faintly chemical buried underneath the damp earth scent. Ranger did not take his eyes off the hallway, but his growl softened the moment Nathan approached the opening again. "You want me to see this?" Nathan whispered. Ranger flicked one ear toward him without looking away from the darkness behind them. Nathan grabbed the lantern hanging beside the old pantry door and managed to ignite it with the emergency lighter from his jacket. Warm amber light spilled across the kitchen walls, softer than the flashlight beam, but steadier somehow. The glow made the old room feel less abandoned, though not safer. Nothing about the house felt safe anymore. Nathan lowered himself carefully onto the narrow stone steps, while Ranger finally turned from the hallway and followed close behind. The stairwell descended deeper than he expected. Moisture dripped steadily from the stone ceiling overhead. The farther down they moved, the quieter the house above became until even the wind disappeared. Only the sound of their breathing remained. Nathan counted 18 steps before the tunnel finally opened into a long underground corridor reinforced with old timber beams darkened by age. The walls were carved directly into packed earth and stone. Rusted pipes lined parts of the ceiling. Some still vibrated faintly, as if water moved somewhere far beyond the tunnel walls. Ranger walked ahead now, slower than before, nose low to the ground. The lantern light flickered across old footprints pressed into the dirt floor. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Nathan crouched beside them. Small prints. Bare feet again. He felt the tightness return to his chest. Someone had been down here long after the house above had supposedly been abandoned. The tunnel curved sharply and ended at a thick wooden door reinforced with rusted metal straps. Strange symbols had been scratched across the wood in uneven circles. Nathan raised the lantern closer and realized they were not symbols at all. They were children's drawings carved over one another so many times the wood had nearly split apart. Stick figures, trees, eyes, houses. One drawing showed a tall man standing beside a lake, while several smaller figures stood beneath the ground below him. Ranger suddenly stopped moving. His ears lifted high. Then came the sound again. Metallic. Closer this time. A slow dragging noise somewhere beyond the door. Nathan felt Ranger press tightly against his leg. Not fear. Warning. Nathan reached carefully for the iron handle and pushed. The hinges screamed softly as the heavy door opened inward. The room beyond stole the air from his lungs. Shelves lined the walls packed with dusty cassette tapes, children's books, glass jars, and stacks of old photographs bundled with twine. A small desk sat in the center beneath a hanging light bulb that should not have worked after decades underground. Yet the bulb flickered weakly overhead the moment Nathan stepped inside. Ranger moved cautiously toward the far corner where an old tape recorder rested on the floor beside a rocking chair. The chair swayed slowly on its own. Back and forth. Back and forth. Nathan stared silently while the weak bulb hummed overhead. Then the tape recorder clicked loudly by itself. Static filled the room for several seconds before a little girl's trembling voice whispered through the speaker. "If you hear him upstairs, do not let him find you." Nathan stood frozen beside the tape recorder while the little girl's voice dissolved back into static. The rocking chair continued moving slowly in the corner beneath the weak hanging bulb, its wooden runners scraping softly against the concrete floor with a rhythm almost gentle enough to feel human. Ranger remained motionless beside Nathan's leg, ears lifted high, eyes fixed toward the darkness beyond the shelves lining the underground room. The dog's breathing had become shallow now. Focused. Nathan lowered the lantern slightly and stepped farther inside. Dust drifted through the warm amber glow like smoke underwater. The shelves along the walls held dozens of old photographs bundled together with faded ribbon. Nathan picked one up carefully. Children. Different ages. Different years. Some smiling beside the lake during summer picnics. Others standing stiffly on the porch above the very house, now groaning beneath the storm outside. Yet one detail repeated in nearly every photograph. The same tall man standing somewhere in the background, watching, sometimes near the trees, sometimes half hidden behind windows, sometimes reflected faintly in mirrors or dark glass. Nathan felt his stomach tighten. The man's face always remained unclear, blurred as though the photographs themselves refused to remember him properly. Ranger growled softly. Nathan turned toward the far side of the room, where several filing cabinets sat crooked against the wall beneath exposed pipes. One cabinet drawer hung partially open. Thin papers spilled onto the floor beside it. Nathan crouched carefully and picked up one of the documents. Medical reports. Handwritten observations. Dates stretching back nearly 40 years. Most of the names belonged to children. Several pages mentioned sleep disturbances, voices inside walls, and fear response when hearing footsteps overhead. Nathan's pulse slowed into the cold, focused rhythm he had learned during combat. Not panic. Pattern recognition. Whatever happened here had not been random. The deeper he looked, the more organized it became. Ranger suddenly stepped away from him, nose twitching rapidly toward the rear wall of the room. Nathan followed with the lantern. Behind the shelves, partially hidden by hanging blankets stiff with age, stood another narrow hallway disappearing deeper underground. Cold air drifted steadily from within, carrying the scent of lake water and rust. Ranger barked once sharply and moved forward before Nathan could stop him. Ranger! The dog ignored him. Nathan followed quickly through the narrow passage where the ceiling lowered enough that he had to duck slightly beneath old pipes wrapped in decaying insulation. Water dripped steadily somewhere ahead. Then the hallway opened into another chamber much larger than the first. Nathan stopped cold. Rows of tiny metal beds filled the room beneath hanging industrial lights. Coated in dust, most were rusted nearly beyond recognition. Small quilts still lay folded at the ends of several mattresses. Toys sat scattered across the floor exactly where someone had left them decades ago. A stuffed rabbit, wooden blocks, a child's red shoe. Ranger walked slowly between the beds, ears pinned low now, tail motionless. Nathan felt the weight of the room settle onto him like wet snow. The silence here felt heavier than anywhere else in the house. Not empty, waiting. Then he noticed the wall. Hundreds of marks scratched into the concrete in uneven rows. Counting marks. Days. Weeks. Maybe years. Nathan raised the lantern closer and saw names carved beside several of them. Some crossed out. Some barely visible anymore beneath water stains and time. Ranger stopped suddenly near the last bed in the corner. His growl deepened. Nathan stepped beside him and lowered the lantern. Beneath the bed sat a small cassette player connected to a set of headphones. The machine clicked softly. Then the tape inside began turning by itself. Static crackled through the chamber before another voice emerged. Older this time. Male. Calm. If someone finally finds this place, do not trust the sheriff. Nathan stared at the cassette player while the tape hissed softly beneath the man's final warning. Do not trust the sheriff. The words settled heavily into the underground silence. Ranger moved uneasily beside the rusted bed frames, nails clicking faintly against the concrete floor as he scanned the shadows between the rows. Nathan crouched and picked up the cassette player carefully. Dust covered most of the machine except the buttons, which looked cleaner than they should have after decades underground. Someone had touched it recently. The realization tightened his chest more than the warning itself. Nathan pressed rewind. The tape spun backward with a low mechanical whir before stopping suddenly with a sharp click. Ranger let out a low growl toward the far wall. Nathan pressed play again. Static crackled through the room before the same man's voice returned, older and weaker this time. My name is Daniel Vale. If this tape survived, then the house did too. They told. The town we abandoned the children after the winter storm, but that was never true. Someone kept them here. Nathan's eyes narrowed instantly at the surname. Vale. Family. Somewhere above them the old house groaned softly as wind pushed against its walls. Daniel continued speaking through the tape, his breathing uneven between sentences. The sheriff helped cover it up. He said people would panic if they knew what was happening beneath the lake house. But Eleanor tried to stop him. She hid the children whenever she could. Nathan glanced toward the rows of metal beds again. The room suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a shelter built in desperation. Ranger stepped closer to one of the beds near the back wall and nudged something hidden beneath the mattress with his nose. Nathan crossed toward him and lifted the decayed fabric carefully. Beneath it lay a small leather journal wrapped inside oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The cover had faded badly, but the initials EV remained visible in gold lettering. Eleanor Vale. Nathan opened the journal slowly. Most pages were filled with hurried handwriting and dates stretching back nearly 40 years. The entries grew shakier over time, but one sentence repeated again and again throughout the pages. He hears them when the house is quiet. Nathan flipped farther ahead. Another entry stopped him cold. December 17, 1983. Sheriff Grayson says the tunnels must stay sealed forever. But the children keep hearing footsteps upstairs even after he leaves. Ranger suddenly barked once. Sharp. Immediate. Nathan looked up. The industrial light overhead flickered violently. Then another sound rolled through the underground chamber. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. Directly above them inside the house. Nathan held still, listening carefully as the steps crossed the ceiling overhead, one heavy movement at a time. Ranger backed closer against him, ears rigid toward the sound. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed for several long seconds. Then came 3 slow knocks from somewhere inside the walls around them. Knock, knock, knock. Nathan felt the vibration through the concrete floor beneath his boots. Ranger growled deeply now, the fur along his back rising stiffly. Nathan grabbed the lantern and swept its glow toward the far side of the chamber. At first he saw nothing except rows of empty beds disappearing into shadow. Then the light caught movement near the rear wall. A child's ball rolled slowly out of the darkness by itself and stopped near Nathan's feet. The old rubber surface looked faded and cracked with age. Nathan stared silently at it while the room seemed to hold its breath around them. Then a little girl's voice whispered from somewhere beyond the beds. He knows you found us. Nathan slowly bent down and picked up the faded rubber ball while the whisper dissolved into silence around the underground chamber. The surface felt cold in his hand, colder than the damp air itself, and for a brief second, he noticed faint writing scratched across one side in faded marker. Lily. Ranger stood rigid beside him, eyes locked toward the darkness beyond the rows of metal beds where the voice had come from. Nathan swept the lantern higher, but the shadows at the far end of the room seemed thicker now, almost alive in the weak amber glow. The underground chamber no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied by memory itself. Somewhere above them, the storm finally returned. Wind slammed against the house overhead with a long, hollow moan that vibrated faintly through the concrete walls. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams. Nathan slipped Eleanor's journal into his jacket and took another slow breath. We are leaving, he muttered quietly to Ranger, though he was no longer certain the dog wanted to go. Ranger suddenly turned toward the tunnel entrance and barked sharply twice. Footsteps echoed faintly from somewhere back along the corridor they had used to enter. Heavy footsteps. Deliberate. Nathan extinguished the lantern immediately. Darkness swallowed the chamber whole except for the weak emergency flashlight clipped against his belt. Ranger pressed close against him without making another sound. The footsteps continued slowly through the tunnel outside. Not imagined this time. Real. Nathan listened carefully, every muscle tightening beneath old instincts he thought he had buried years ago. Whoever moved through the tunnel above the dirt floor carried weight. Adult weight. The steps paused just beyond the chamber entrance. Silence followed. Nathan held his breath. Then came the sound of metal scraping softly against concrete outside the doorway. Ranger's growl vibrated low and dangerous in the darkness. Nathan reached instinctively for the handgun locked inside his backpack upstairs and cursed himself silently for leaving it there. Another scrape echoed outside the room. Then a beam of pale light slid slowly across the tunnel entrance, as if someone else carried a flashlight through the underground corridor. Nathan felt ice settle into his chest. Someone else was inside the tunnels. Ranger shifted slightly beside him, prepared to move. The flashlight beam lingered at the doorway for several long seconds before disappearing again. Then the footsteps retreated slowly back through the tunnel. One step at a time. Calm. Unhurried. Nathan waited nearly a full minute before turning the lantern back on. Ranger immediately moved toward the corridor entrance, nose low to the ground. Nathan followed carefully. The dirt floor outside showed fresh boot prints leading away through the tunnel. Large prints. Modern tread. Not old. Ranger sniffed them once and let out a tense whine. Nathan studied the marks in silence. Someone had been watching them underground. The realization changed everything. The whispers, the warnings, the hidden rooms. None of it belonged entirely to the past. Nathan and Ranger followed the fresh tracks back through the corridor toward the stone stairwell beneath the kitchen. As they climbed upward, the house above sounded different now. Louder. The storm rattled every window violently, while floorboards creaked overhead beneath the pressure of the wind. Nathan emerged carefully into the kitchen and froze immediately. The hidden trapdoor beneath the floor remained open exactly where they had left it. But the kitchen itself had changed. Every cabinet door now stood wide open. Plates and glasses covered the floor. The wooden chairs had been turned to face the hallway entrance, as though someone had arranged them. There while they were underground. Ranger barked once toward the dark hallway beyond the kitchen. Nathan raised the lantern slowly. At the far end of the hall near the staircase stood a tall figure wearing an old sheriff's coat, soaked dark with rainwater. The brim of the hat shadowed his face completely. He did not move. He only stood there holding a flashlight pointed toward the floor, while water dripped steadily from the edges of his coat onto the wood beneath him. Then the figure spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "You should not have opened the tunnels." The storm roared against the old lake house while the figure in the sheriff's coat stood motionless at the end of the hallway, rainwater dripping steadily onto the floorboards beneath him. Ranger planted himself in front of Nathan, lips curled back slightly, the deep warning growl in his chest vibrating through the kitchen like distant thunder. Nathan tightened his grip on the lantern and stared into the darkness beneath the sheriff's hat brim, trying to make out a face. "Who are you?" he asked calmly, though every instinct in him already knew the answer. The figure tilted his head slightly. "Name is Walter Grayson," the man replied. His voice sounded rough with age and exhaustion, but there was something else underneath it. "Regret. Sheriff of Blackwater Cove. Or I used to be." Lightning flashed through the kitchen windows, briefly illuminating the hallway in cold white light. Nathan finally saw the man's face. Late 60s. Deep lines carved into pale skin. Gray beard soaked with rain. Tired eyes that looked older than the storm outside. Ranger's growl softened slightly, but did not disappear. Grayson glanced toward the open trapdoor in the kitchen floor and shook his head slowly. "You should have left that buried." Nathan stepped forward carefully. Those tunnels were full of children's beds. The sheriff closed his eyes briefly as if the words physically hurt him. Wind rattled the windows overhead. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed shut hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Grayson looked up instinctively toward the second floor before lowering his voice. "This town lost people a long time ago. Children vanished during the winter of 1983. Folks blamed the storm, the lake, runaways, anything except the truth." Nathan studied him silently. Ranger moved closer to the sheriff now, sniffing the damp air around him. The old man smelled real. Human. Not another shadow inside the house. "What truth?" Nathan asked. Grayson hesitated too long before answering. "Your Aunt Eleanor tried to protect them." Another loud creak echoed from upstairs. Slow footsteps crossed the hallway ceiling above them. Nathan saw Grayson flinch at the sound. Not surprised. Afraid. The sheriff looked toward the staircase with hollow eyes. Somebody started using those tunnels years before the disappearances. Smuggling routes first, then hiding places. Eleanor found out children were being kept underground during storms because nobody would hear them over the lake wind. Nathan felt Eleanor's journal heavy inside his jacket. Who kept them there? Grayson's silence answered before his words did. Ranger suddenly barked sharply toward the staircase. Both men turned instantly. A little girl stood halfway up the stairs wearing the pale blue dress Nathan had seen earlier. Water dripped slowly from the ends of her hair onto the steps beneath her bare feet. She looked no older than 8. Her eyes remained fixed on Grayson. The sheriff's face drained of color. "Lily," he whispered. The little girl lifted one trembling hand and pointed upward toward the second-floor hallway. Then she vanished. Not suddenly. Slowly. Like fog dissolving into darkness. Nathan felt cold settle through the entire house. Ranger backed closer against him with another low growl. Grayson removed his soaked sheriff's hat and rubbed one shaking hand across his face. "I buried every file," he murmured quietly. "Every report. Every witness statement. I thought if the town forgot, maybe the house would too." Another sound rolled through the ceiling overhead. Not footsteps this time. a heavy dragging noise moving slowly across the second floor. Nathan watched the sheriff carefully. "You know who is upstairs?" Grayson stared toward the darkness above them for several long seconds before answering. "No," he said softly. But whatever stayed in this house after 1983 was never human again. The dragging sound above them continued slowly across the second floor ceiling while rain hammered the windows hard enough to make the glass tremble inside its frames. Nathan stared toward the staircase, every instinct sharpening into cold focus. Ranger stood perfectly still beside him now, ears lifted high toward the movement overhead. Even Sheriff Grayson looked afraid to breathe too loudly. The old man rubbed his shaking hands together once before speaking again. "Eleanor believed the house remembered things," he said quietly. "Pain, fear, people. She used to say places near deep water hold on to echoes longer than they should." Nathan glanced toward him. "You are telling me the house is haunted?" Grayson gave a tired, hollow smile that vanished almost immediately. "No," he murmured. "I am telling you some secrets do not stay buried when enough people suffer inside the same walls." Another loud thud echoed upstairs. Ranger barked sharply toward the ceiling. Nathan made his decision instantly. "I am going up there." Grayson grabbed his arm before he could move. His grip felt surprisingly strong for a man his age. "If you hear knocking," the sheriff whispered, "do not answer it." Nathan held the old man's eyes for a second before pulling free gently. Then he reached into his backpack near the kitchen table and retrieved the handgun he had left earlier beside the emergency supplies. Ranger moved beside him immediately as they approached the staircase together. The air grew colder with every step upward. Behind them, Grayson remained near the kitchen entrance, clutching his sheriff's hat tightly against his chest while the storm groaned through the old house around them. The second-floor hallway looked different now. Longer somehow. Darker. Nathan raised the flashlight slowly. The wallpaper near the ceiling had begun peeling away in long strips that fluttered faintly despite the complete absence of wind inside the house. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above the attic stairs. Ranger stopped halfway down the hall beside the room with the music box and stared toward the far end where the attic staircase disappeared into darkness. Nathan noticed the wet footprints again. Bare feet. Fresh. They crossed the hallway toward the attic steps before vanishing completely near the final stair. Ranger let out a low, uneasy growl. Then the knocking began. 3 slow knocks from inside the attic overhead. Knock. 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 Nathan felt the sound vibrate faintly through the wood beneath his boots. The house seemed to fall silent afterward, listening. Ranger pressed tightly against Nathan's leg, but did not retreat. Nathan climbed the narrow attic staircase slowly while dust drifted through the flashlight beam like ash. The smell changed immediately near the top. Not mildew. Not decay. Smoke. Old smoke trapped inside wood for decades. Nathan reached the attic door and paused. Thin scratches covered the surface around the handle from years of desperate hands clawing at the wood. Ranger whimpered softly behind him. Nathan pushed the door open. The attic stretched wide beneath the steep roofline, filled with old trunks, broken furniture, and white sheets hanging like ghosts in the dim flashlight glow. Rain drummed against the roof overhead in soft, uneven rhythms. Nathan swept the beam slowly across the room until it landed on the far wall. Dozens of photographs had been pinned there with rusted nails. Children, families, missing person flyers, newspaper clippings. And in the center of them all hung a single large portrait of Eleanor Vale, staring directly into the camera with tired, sorrowful eyes. Across the bottom of the frame, someone had scratched one sentence into the wood beneath her picture. "He never left the house." Ranger suddenly barked violently toward the corner behind the hanging sheets. Nathan spun instantly, raising the flashlight and handgun together. A figure stood motionless in the darkness between the old trunks. Tall, thin, wearing a dark coat soaked with water. The beam climbed slowly upward toward the figure's face. But there was no face at all. Only shadow beneath the hood where a human face should have been. Nathan raised the flashlight higher while Ranger barked furiously beside him, the sound echoing through the attic beneath the pounding storm outside. The hooded figure remained perfectly still between the hanging sheets and old trunks, dark water dripping slowly onto the wooden floor beneath it. Nathan tightened his grip on the handgun, though something deep inside him already knew the weapon would not matter here. The flashlight beam trembled slightly as he stepped forward. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure did not answer. Ranger lunged ahead a single step, growling low and savage, but then suddenly stopped. Nathan noticed the dog's posture change instantly. Confusion replaced aggression. Ranger tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then the attic lights flickered. Once. Twice. The hooded figure vanished. Nathan spun immediately, sweeping the flashlight wildly across the attic. Empty trunks. Hanging sheets drifting softly. Dust floating through the beam. Nothing else. Ranger moved quickly toward the corner where the figure had stood moments earlier and began scratching hard against the wooden floorboards beneath an old cedar chest. Nathan rushed over and shoved the chest aside. The floor beneath it looked newer than the surrounding wood. Thin gaps lined the edges of a square section built into the attic floor itself. Hidden compartment. Nathan dropped to one knee and wedged his fingers beneath the edge. The panel resisted before finally lifting open with a long, splintering creak. Cold air rushed upward from the darkness below, carrying the smell of lake water and old paper. Ranger barked once sharply into the opening. Nathan shined the flashlight downward. A narrow crawl space stretched beneath the attic floor, barely tall enough for a grown man to move through. At the far end sat a small wooden box wrapped carefully in cloth. Nathan crawled inside while the storm shook the house around them. The wood groaned beneath every movement overhead. Ranger stayed close behind him, pressing forward through the tight space until Nathan reached the box. Dust coated the lid except for one clean handprint pressed across the top. Recent. Nathan opened it slowly. Inside lay dozens of letters bundled together with faded blue ribbon beside it. Old reel-to-reel tape recorder, and several black and white photographs. Nathan picked up the first letter carefully. Eleanor's handwriting. "My name is Eleanor Vale, and if someone finds this, then the house has finally decided to speak." Nathan's pulse slowed. He kept reading. Sheriff Grayson was never the monster people believed. He tried to stop what was happening after the children disappeared underground during the blizzard. But the man responsible never left Blackwater Cove. He stayed inside the house. Nathan frowned. The next sentence made the cold inside him deepen instantly. "The house hides him because the children were never meant to escape." Ranger began whining softly beside him. Nathan grabbed one of the photographs from the box and froze. It showed a younger Eleanor standing beside Sheriff Grayson near the lake during winter. Behind them, reflected faintly in the frozen water itself, stood the same hooded figure Nathan had just seen in the attic. No face. Only darkness beneath the hood. Nathan turned the photo over. Written on the back in Eleanor's trembling handwriting were 6 words. "He only appears when someone remembers." Then the reel-to-reel recorder inside the box clicked loudly by itself. The tape wheels began turning slowly, even though nothing was plugged into power. Static filled the crawl space before Eleanor's frightened voice whispered through the speaker. "Nathan, if you hear knocking from inside the walls tonight, do not open the door beneath the lake." The reel-to-reel recorder continued spinning inside the crawl space, while Eleanor's voice dissolved into static around Nathan and Ranger. Rain hammered the roof above them with a force that made the entire attic tremble softly beneath the storm. Nathan stared down at the letters and photographs spread across the wooden floorboards while a deep, terrible understanding slowly settled into place inside him. The house had not been protecting a secret. It had been trapping one. Ranger suddenly stiffened beside him. His ears lifted sharply toward the far end of the crawl space where darkness pressed against the weak flashlight beam. Then came the sound. Knock, knock, knock. Not from the attic. Not from the walls. From somewhere beneath the lake outside the house. The vibration rolled faintly upward through the beams beneath them like distant thunder moving underwater. Ranger backed away immediately, growling low and uneasy. Nathan crawled out from beneath the attic floor and rose carefully to his feet. The storm outside had begun to weaken now. Wind still rattled the windows, but the long, violent bursts of rain had softened into a steady whisper across the roof. Somewhere downstairs, Sheriff Grayson shouted something Nathan could not fully hear. Then came the sound of the front door slamming open below. Nathan rushed toward the attic staircase with Ranger close behind him. The second-floor hallway stood empty when they reached it, but water covered the floorboards in long, narrow trails leading toward the staircase below. Nathan descended quickly. "Sheriff." No answer came. The kitchen trapdoor remained open. Lantern light flickered weakly across the floor. But Grayson was gone. Only his sheriff's hat remained beside the doorway, soaked with rainwater. Ranger moved instantly toward the back porch entrance near the lakeside of the house and barked sharply. Nathan followed him outside. Fog drifted low across the shoreline, while dawn slowly began bleeding pale gray light through the storm clouds overhead. The lake looked strangely calm now, smooth as black glass beneath the fading rain. Ranger trotted toward the old dock extending into the water behind the house. Halfway down the dock, he stopped and stared downward. Nathan approached slowly. Then he saw it beneath the water. A large iron door built directly into the stone beneath the lake's surface several feet below the dock. Thick chains covered most of it, darkened by rust and age. Tiny bubbles rose steadily upward from somewhere behind the submerged door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed faintly through the water beneath them. Nathan felt cold spread through his chest. Eleanor's warning returned instantly in his mind. Do not open the door beneath the lake. Ranger whimpered softly and stepped backward away from the edge. Nathan stared into the black water while dawn light slowly spread across the lake around them. Then movement caught his eye near the shoreline. Sheriff Grayson stood beneath the trees watching them silently from the mist. His face looked exhausted now, peaceful somehow. Nathan took one step toward him. What is behind that door? Grayson lowered his eyes toward the lake. Everything this town tried to forget, he answered quietly. The old sheriff removed something from his coat pocket and held it out. A ring of